So, from the start of an Inspector Calls, it should be clear to the audience that the Burlings are a family with a great deal of power. After all, Mr. Burling makes a point of telling everyone all about his status at any given opportunity. He's a factory owner, so he controls the lives of all his workers. He's an alderman, which is a type of local judge, so he has a direct say in matters of law. And he used to be mayor of Brumley, so he's had a hand in the overall running of the town to some degree. Meanwhile, Mrs. Burling is one of those rare ladies of 1912 whose status enables her to stand on her own 2 feet and be seen as an individual and not just the wife of Arthur Burling. And because of this, she's able to stand as a chairperson of a local charity committee for women. This gives her the power to decide where the charity's donations are spent, and which people who ask for support are more deserving of it. Both Mr. and Mrs. Burling are clearly in a position where the decisions and value judgments they make have a huge effect on the lives of others, and as they tend to look down their nose at everyone around them, this obviously leads to regular misuses of their power. Their decision-making process, as illustrated by Burling's after-dinner speech, is based around self-interest and not in helping others. Let's remind ourselves of some of Mr. Burling's most choice quotes from early in the play. He says, "We employers are at last coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected. A man has to make his own way, has to look after himself, and a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own." He describes community, or a sense of social spirit, as nonsense, and anyone who believes in it are, in his eyes, cranks. Let's not forget that he used to be mayor, and if these are his beliefs, then we have to assume he spent that entire time making decisions without thinking about the community he was responsible for or the people in it. He just used his position to further his own interests. Of course, Burling's spiel is interrupted by the arrival of the inspector, whose attitudes are the polar opposite from those of Mr. Burling. Inspector Goole is, like J.B. Priestley, a socialist, and believes that the actions of everyone have a domino effect that touch upon the lives of everyone else around them. This is a completely alien concept to Mr. Burling. He really gives the impression that he's never considered it before in his life. Just take a look at this exchange. Burling describes the concept of social responsibility as awkward. And by the way he describes it as an impossible position, we can take this to mean inconvenient. The idea is almost a joke to Burling, and the inspector's response, just one example of Goole throwing Burling's own words back at him, should be seen as someone responding to a joke with a completely serious face. It's also worth noting Eric's response here, which supports his father's opinion, though he's beginning to change his stance and think for himself by his very next line in the play. Here, Burling is trying to justify the ultimatum he gave the girls on strike at Burling and Company, which was basically, if you don't like it, get out. And Eric responds with an uncharacteristic level of compassion and maturity. He's thinking about the girls here, and how difficult it might be for them to find another job or support themselves if they were to quit the job they had. Eric will continue to become more considerate of others as the play progresses, while his father will remain the same stone golem right up until the end. This section of the play also gives us the clearest bit of dialogue highlighting Burling and the inspector's completely opposing attitudes. When Burling says, "If you don't come down sharply on these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth," to which the inspector replies, "They might, but after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it." On the one hand, Burling thinks the girls were being selfish and jeopardizing his business by asking for a pay rise. On the other, the inspector thinks Burling was being selfish and jeopardizing the girls' lives by not giving them what they asked for. And as this conversation, and indeed the whole play, takes place within the lavish Burling house, it's clear that the 12% pay increase the girls were asking for would not have bankrupted Burling, though it might have forced him to cut down on port and cigars a little bit. However, the 12% from the top of Burling's wealth would have made the world of difference to the girls working at the factory. So it's clear Mr. Burling is intended to look like a hypocrite to the audience. When he tells Eric, "It's about time you learnt to face a few responsibilities," he is completely oblivious to the fact that this is the exact same message the inspector wants him to take away throughout the play, most notably when Goole says to him, "Public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges." Indeed, to really understand the difference between the Burlings and Inspector Goole, we have to look at how the play explores morality and social responsibility in a little bit more depth. For example, if we consider Gerald's assertion that he and the Burlings are respectable citizens and not criminals, and the inspector's response that sometimes there isn't as much difference as you think, it becomes clear that the inspector is more than simply a police officer or an agent of the law. He also adheres to a strict moral code and doesn't believe that the law is enough to protect the more vulnerable members of society from misuses of power. If we consider the law to be a line between being a criminal and being a good person, then Gerald and the older Burlings do not see anything wrong in tiptoeing right up to that line and abusing the system as much as they can without actually breaking the law in order to get what they want. However, as an agent of the law, the inspector knows that it is the rich and powerful people like the Burlings who create the laws in society, and they do so in a way that will ensure they are able to get what they want. So we can draw another line for the inspector, one that sits far back from the edge of criminal law, and which follows a code of moral law instead. For the inspector, being a good person sits not behind the line of criminal law, but the line of moral law, and his goal is to make the Burlings realise that the worst behaviour is not to be a criminal in the classic sense, but to exist in the space between his moral line and the law. The Burlings act in a way that anyone with a conscience would know to be wrong, but it's technically legal, so therefore they feel it's acceptable. They can remain upstanding members of society even though they exist within this morally grey area, and despite the fact their existence has a detrimental effect on others. In the case of Eric and Sheila, they also begin the play towing the line of criminal law, but as the play progresses and the inspector explains his ethics to them, they begin to step backwards until they stand at the moral line with the inspector, fully aware that it's wrong to live in the morally grey area between morality and the law even if they can get away with it. And of course with Eric, this applies right up until the point that we discover he's stolen money from the factory, when he just becomes a common criminal, regardless of how good his intentions have become. In contrast, Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald do not step back from the line of criminal law and do not see this murky responsibility as an issue, which is exactly what enables them to dismiss the inspector's lessons as soon as he's left the house. We can take this theory and apply it to the way the characters behave in a very real way. For example, it is not illegal for Mr. Burling to refuse to pay his workers a decent wage, and it is not illegal for him to fire any worker who causes trouble or lowers morale in the workplace. However, it is morally wrong to leave his workers unable to support themselves in order to furnish his luxurious lifestyle. It is not illegal for Mrs. Burling to turn a pregnant woman away from possible salvation and refuse to support her. However, it is morally wrong of her to dismiss Eva Smith because she looks down upon her as an unmarried pregnant woman and has taken a personal dislike towards her. Again, this is a level of social power that in J.B. Priestley's view, nobody should be able to wield. It is certainly not illegal for Gerald to cheat on his girlfriend, keep his mistress in a room and pay for her services as one might a prostitute. But it is morally indefensible to betray your future wife in this way, just as it is to offer a lonely person hope and then abandon them altogether. In Sheila's case, it isn't illegal to use your social standing to have someone fired, particularly if that person has caused you offence and is incompetent in their job. It is, of course, morally disgraceful to have someone fired simply because you're bitter that they look better than you in clothes you don't even own. And for Eric? Well, there's no doubt that sexual assault is illegal, as is theft. So out of all the Burlings, he's the character whose behaviour will bring the most shame on the family. But in terms of his morality, he stands on equal footing with his family, redeemed slightly because at least his actions showed some attempt to be morally righteous. He asked Eva Smith to marry him to protect her social standing, and stole money from the factory so he could support her and the baby, as was his social responsibility. Overall, this grey morality is why the inspector can confidently tell Sheila, "You're partly to blame," and why we can consider all of the Burlings partly responsible for the death of Eva Smith, even though they have for the most part broken no laws. The inspector's final, parting message to the Burlings breaks this concept down to the binary extremes of love and hate. His overall message? We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. If we choose to love one another, then everyone will be better off. And if we choose not to help one another, well, J.B. Priestley, sitting at his typewriter at the end of the Second World War, knows exactly how that will turn out, in fire and blood and anguish. And it's clear that he blames the attitudes of people like the Burlings for the world becoming consumed by hatred in the intervening 40 years. Ultimately, the issue here isn't that the Burlings are mean people, though they most certainly appear mean to anyone who looks to them for sympathy. The issue here is that they simply don't take the trouble to think about anyone but themselves. Their selfishness is so hardwired that when the inspector relates Eversmith's troubles to those of society at large, it is obvious by the other characters' reactions that they have never even thought about it before. Eric and Sheila respond to the inspector's plea to consider other people with something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, I guess that is a thing, huh?" While the inspector's sardonic, dry response, "I've had that notion myself from time to time," is probably best thought of as the verbal equivalent of someone sighing and shaking their head in disbelief. Indeed, neither Eric or Sheila's actions against Eversmith come from a place of spite or animosity. They're both just incredibly selfish. Sheila is so egotistical, she assumes that when someone close by her smiles, they must be mocking her, and she responds to this in the only way she knows, by asserting power the way her mother would. Meanwhile, Eric is a hedonist, someone who only lives for pleasure and instant gratification. And this is why he's a philandering alcoholic, which in turn is what leads to all his problems. If either of them took one moment to think about the consequences of their actions on the people around them, the conscience they both show in the play suggests they would have made better choices. After all, they both fight against their parents' conditioning and end the play regretting that they never learned to take care of each other before it was too late. What is really important to note here is that there is a sense of hope. It's the older characters who reject their social and moral responsibility, but the two younger Burlings wholeheartedly embrace what they've learnt about themselves. They will take care of others and follow the path of love. Of course, it won't be enough to stop 2 world wars, but perhaps if they raise their own children with more consideration than they were raised themselves, the world might one day be united and everyone might get a fair deal. Question 1. Question 2. Question 3.